song, Mr. Mark. That's fantastic. We're continuing our series on this Palm Sunday, Listen for Grace. We've been talking about God's grace, how we experience God's grace, the different ways in which God's grace is manifest. And so we're continuing that as we think about Zacchaeus. Now, many people find that this season, the season that we're in, is a heavy season, a burdensome season. Some people speak of it as a dark time. They think of how this is a time when we take inventory and sometimes we come up short. Now, I'm not speaking of Lent, I'm speaking of tax season, actually. Is anybody a fan of tax season? Well, there might be a few. There might be a few where it's where perhaps for accountants and others, although it's a very busy time, it is a profitable time. But tax season, is not our favorite thing, and taxes in general are not our favorite thing. But that's nothing compared to the system of taxation that Zacchaeus was a part of. When we hear that Zacchaeus was a tax collector, and that's one of the things we learn about Zacchaeus right off the bat, we think, okay, he works for the Internal Revenue Service of the day. Maybe he's tax assessor collector for the region around Jericho, something like that. But it's much different than that. He had put in a bid for the job, and he had won the bid with the Roman Empire, the occupying force. And so his responsibility was to pay the Roman Empire what they had coming in taxes. But he could charge anything he wanted to, and he could keep the difference. That was the corrupt system of taxation in existence at that time. And so when someone was called a tax collector, it was about the worst thing in the world they could be. They were seen as traitors who had sold out to Rome, the occupying forces. And they were seen as crooked, and they were seen as those who enriched themselves, climbing over the backs of others. Most of the people who paid the taxes, many of them could not afford to pay any taxes at all, and yet they were taxed to the point of poverty. And that was the system. And Zacchaeus was a tax collector. Now, Zacchaeus knew who he was, and he heard people, as he walked around, he could hear people point their finger at him and say that he was a sinner, a tax collector, and a sinner. He would walk through a crowd, although he tried to keep his distance from people because he didn't know what sort of accident might happen to him in a big crowd. He would hear the boos and the hisses, and he knew who he was. But there was something going on within Zacchaeus, and we don't really know what it was, but he must have had some sense that he needed something else in his life, that he was off track somewhere. We know that Zacchaeus was at least familiar with what God required of people. Jesus says that he too was a son of Abraham, and so we know that he was familiar with the traditions, he was familiar with the law, and he knew what God required of him. And so he must have experienced that distance between who he was and who he knew that God had created him to be and called him to be. And maybe that's what prompted him to do two things that were really unusual for a man in his station of life to do. The first one, it says that when he wanted to see Jesus and he knew that the crowd would be taller than he was short, he ran to see him. Now, we talked about this a few weeks ago, and we talked about Jacob and Esau. And when Esau ran to meet his brother, that's an astounding thing because the patriarch, the important man in antiquity, never ran. Servants would run to serve them, but they themselves would not run. But he was so motivated to greet his brother Jacob that he ran and embraced him. When Jesus tells the story of the prodigal son, you remember we talked about that? The father runs to embrace his son who has squandered everything in this far country. He does the thing that's undignified. He runs. Well, that's what Zacchaeus does. Zacchaeus runs ahead of the crowd and climbs up in a tree. And that's the second weird thing that Zacchaeus does. I mean, an important chief tax collector would not climb a tree, for goodness sake, to see some itinerant preacher from Podunk, Nazareth, in the middle of nowhere. But that's exactly what he does. He climbs up the tree just to catch a glimpse of Jesus. What's going on with him? He has this need in his life that he has experienced. He wants something, but perhaps he can't quite put that into words. This whole story of Zacchaeus, the tax collector, the man from Jericho, the one who was rich, and that means we know that he got rich on the backs of other people. The one who was short, we know that about Zacchaeus. But there's something else here. Zacchaeus has some need in his life that causes him to be up a tree. And so I want to set his story aside for just a moment and fast forward to the present time, because this is a story about God's grace and the movement of God's grace in our lives today. And so I want to tell you very quickly about a guy that I know named, I'll just call him Jeff. That's not his real name. He was a member of a previous congregation that I served in the past. And Jeff has a great story to tell. Now, he's different from Zacchaeus. He's not short. He's of, sort of medium build, maybe a bit tall. He's not a tax collector. He is an accountant and an entrepreneur, but not a tax collector. But he has some things in common with Zacchaeus. And one of those things is he was in this place in his life where he could see the distance between who he knew God wanted him to be and who he was. He grew up also, as Zacchaeus did, in a religious tradition. His happened to be Christianity. But he had gone away from that. Years later, he has a family. And he does share also with Zacchaeus that all of his business practices had not been completely on the up and up. Nothing really illegal, but his view of business was never win-win. It was win-lose, and he had to be the winner. And so he had hurt some people along the way, and he had cheated some people along the way, and he was aware of that. So he was living with that, and one Saturday evening, he was watching TV, and this was years ago when we had the commercials for the United Methodist Church, open hearts, open minds, open doors, the people of the United Methodist Church. One of those ads came on, and he had seen it before, but somehow there was just something different that evening, and he said, when they were getting ready for bed, he said to his wife something that absolutely floored her. He said, "Hey, tomorrow morning, why don't we all go to church?" And she said, okay, like that. And they did. The next morning they went to church. Now, the reason that I am telling the story of Jeff and I'm telling the story of Zacchaeus, because there's a parallel here. Jeff had some sense that there was something missing, something he needed. There was just a need for him. And so he responded to that. He made some movement toward that, as did Zacchaeus. So Zacchaeus is up the tree. Jesus comes and finds him there. Notice that Jesus sought him out. Jesus went to see him. And when we speak of grace, we speak of God's grace in three different ways. As the grace of God, as God seeking us out before we're even aware of God or aware or have the ability to make a commitment even, God is at work in our lives. That's God's grace. And we call that prevenient grace. And it's just a word that means the grace that comes before belief, that comes before commitment. And so that Jesus goes to the tree and seeks Zacchaeus out is always the way that God is working to woo us into relationship. Like a shepherd going after a lost sheep, Jesus taught us. That's how God is. And so Jesus goes to Zacchaeus. And we go back to the story of Jeff. Jeff showed up at church. Now, he said things did not go like he planned that morning. For one thing, they had a hard time getting everybody ready for church. Anybody familiar with that phenomenon? Lost shoes, trying to find the clothes, trying to get everybody together, trying to get breakfast done, all that kind of thing. and this was a new experience for them, so that made it even worse. So they were late. And the church I was serving at that time didn't have adequate parking, and so they had to park 2 blocks away, and they made their way to the church. And he said the second thing he didn't expect was how hard it would be to pull open that big wooden door. That church had big wooden doors like ours. And he didn't know what was going to be on the other side. They were late, and he really thought about very seriously turning back and just leaving. But they pulled the door open, and they went in. Service had already started, and this was a United Methodist church, and so they had to go almost down to the front to find a seat. And so they did find a seat, and they were sitting together on that pew. The service started. 5 minutes into it, their 4-year-old son had to go to the bathroom. And so he volunteered, Jeff did, to take the son to the bathroom. Didn't know where the bathroom was, of course. And so went out, back down the aisle into the bathroom. They came back in, and just as the children's moment was beginning, the children were coming forward. Jeff didn't know what was going on. He asked his wife. She said, "You need to take him up to the front." So took him up to the front, and he was a little bit uncomfortable and didn't want to stay up there by himself, and so Jeff stayed with him. And he wanted to bolt and run, and I'm not talking about his son. I'm talking about Jeff. But he stayed with it. Now here's the thing. He recounted later how somewhere in the midst of that service, in his imagination, he pictured Jesus coming to him and saying, "Hey, let's take a walk." And they went for a walk in his imagination. And Jesus was talking to him and saying that he wanted to be in relationship with him. And all this is going on in that service of worship. And I don't know if it had anything at all to do with what else was going on in there. I mean, some things you just don't plan. And this is what he experienced. I believe that what he was experiencing is the same kind of prevenient grace that Zacchaeus experienced, that God was coming to him in this special way and seeking him out and wanting to be in relationship with him. And so that's God's grace at work. That's God's grace at work, not just way back with Zacchaeus, but now, today. And so Zacchaeus is up in the tree, and Jesus seeks him out. Jesus invites him to come down then and to have dinner with him. And this is an amazing moment. Everybody is murmuring about that because he is, as they're murmuring to one another, he's a sinner. What is he doing going and having dinner with a sinner? It's an amazing moment because Jesus sees in Zacchaeus something else. The description of Zacchaeus that I like best is one that Frederick Buechner had. Frederick Buechner said, Zacchaeus was a sawed-off little social disaster with a big bank account and a crooked job. But then he said, but Jesus welcomed him aboard anyway. And we see that. Jesus invites himself to dinner. He saw something else in Zacchaeus. You know what the name Zacchaeus means? Okay, picture this. Let's say you work in an office, and there's a member of the office staff you work with who is the grumpiest person in the office, the absolute grumpiest person in the office, and her name is Joy. Or there's someone else in the office who is such a pessimist. I mean, everything's going to go wrong. It's just horrible. Everything's horrible. And her name is Hope. Or someone named Charity who happens to be the most stingy person around. You see? That's how it is with Zacchaeus. Because Zacchaeus' name means pure, innocent in Hebrew. Don't you know, as he walked around, people laughed about, well, there goes Mr. Innocent. There goes purity. He did not fit that name at all. But I think Jesus knew that somehow there was a part of him that did fit the name, and that he could live into that name. He could be transformed. Because what we're talking about here is the transforming power of grace. And we see that at work here. And so Jesus has him come down and they go to dinner, and to sit down and eat with someone in that culture is to be reconciled to that person. It's to extend forgiveness. It's what Jesus did with his disciples as he transformed that Seder meal into this meal of reconciliation and proclaiming forgiveness. And they go to dinner. And Zacchaeus is able to put the past in the past. He's able to be forgiven. And then his life is changed. Well, Jeff experienced that, and it was over time. It was over a period of time that he came to really understand that God's grace meant him too, and that he could be forgiven for what he had done, that he could change his life and be different, and that God loved him just as he was. And then he could respond to God's love. And that's what Zacchaeus did. When Jesus extended that invitation, what did he do? He said, I'm going to give half of everything I own to the poor, and if I have cheated anyone of anything, which he certainly had, then I will restore it fourfold. A remarkable change for Zacchaeus. The beginning, really, of God's grace at work in his life to help him be who God created him to be, to live into that name Zacchaeus, and to be who God was calling him to be. We call that sanctifying grace. It's God's grace at work in us when we open our lives to God, to enable us to love as Jesus loved even, to enable us to serve, to enable us to more and more have the mind and the heart of Jesus as we live our lives. Jeff experienced that too, by the way. And it would be tempting to say, and they all lived happily ever after, but of course it's not quite that simple, is it? I mean, the challenges of living into a new life, the challenges of remaining open to God at working in your life, it's not necessarily an easy thing. It requires discipline. It requires constant vigilance, really. And that's part of what the Christian life is about. It's part of what we focus on in the season of Lent. It's what the means of grace are about that we've talked about. It's the things we do to enable God to be at work in our lives, to enable us to be open to God to work in our lives. Now, we don't know what happened to Zacchaeus after that, but I suspect that Zacchaeus stayed on the path. Otherwise, I'm not sure this story would have made it into the Gospel of Luke. He probably did. He probably stayed on the path. Now, he probably had his ups and downs. He probably wrestled with that. The next morning when he woke up, he might have said, "What have I done?" And then he wrestled with trying to live into this new life that would be his. Now, there's a key word in all of this that Luke loves to use, and he uses it 11 times in his gospel. Mark, for example, only uses the word once. And it's the word that's translated today. Because Jesus says, after Zacchaeus, that is, has made this commitment for a new life, Jesus said, today salvation has come to this house. Today. It's that word today that Luke loves to use. Today I bring you tidings of great joy, Luke says in the 2nd chapter. 4th chapter of Luke, when Jesus teaches in his hometown synagogue, he says, this scripture is today fulfilled in your hearing. Over and over again, Luke loves that word. And I think the reason why is he wants to make the good news of our faith and that relationship immediate to us today. I think the message for us today is that God's grace is still at work in our lives today. That transformation is still possible today. That whatever has happened in the past can remain in the past and we can move into new life today. Because God is still at work in lives today. That is the good news of our faith that we celebrate today and that we take with us into this sacred week. Amen.